Hello and welcome to Effective Conflict Resolution, Enhancing Workplace Dynamics for Optimal Team Performance. My name is Melissa Janis, and I'm delighted to be your moderator today as we talk about this very important concept. So I'm going to ask you to please put in the chat where you're dialing in from. I'm coming to you from New York, and I would love to know where in the world you are hearing this panel discussion for today. I'm going to encourage you to participate in the chat. We will be reading and hopefully interacting throughout the session. And let me move on and introduce the rest of the panel. And here they are. Welcome, everyone. This is a very unusual panel we have today. I'm excited to say, because we have, no kidding, 2 Melissas, 2 Jessicas, and 1 Alex for good measure. What we don't have is a moderator, or I should say, the originally planned moderator. So in some second world meta concept, we have a conflict leading into the conflict session. And our moderator had a conflict to deal with and wasn't able to be with us today. So instead of having tension and perhaps destructive conflict, we had collaboration. And here we are today with this fantastic panel. So I'd love to go around and introduce everyone. And if I could ask you to share with us who you are, what brought you here today, and what your passion is around conflict, that would be fantastic. I'm just going to go around. Let's start with Alex, and we'll go clockwise around. At least I hope we're all seeing the same order, but I see Alex next. So welcome, Alex.
Hi, thank you, Melissa, and of course,
we're having problems with your sound.
Oh no. Okay, why don't you go to the next person? Let me try to fix that.
Try that again. I think you might be muted.
You can go to the next person.
Okay, we're going to go on to Jess Goldberg, if I may. Hi, Jess.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, I'm so excited to be here with all of you. My name is Jess Goldberg. I teach communication.
Can you all hear each other?
Yes.
I think maybe
I'm having audio issues. Okay, go on to it. I'm going to come out of this.
Continue. But yeah, I'm excited to be here with all of you. My name is Jess Goldberg. I teach communication skills at Columbia University, and I'm also an executive coach, and I teach courses on a place called Maven. So I'm really excited to be with all of you today, to diving into conflict resolution and how we deal with conflict. I deeply believe that the most underrated skill that any leader can have is to be a great conflict negotiator. There are so many problems that we have as HR leaders, and it's really important to be able to deal with conflict.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jess. And I share that with you and our Columbia background, so that's good to know.
Amazing.
Okay, let's go back to Alex if we may, because apparently it was my issue and not yours. So go back to Alex.
Oh, sure. Okay. Hi, everyone. Alex Prasis. So I have a background across many aspects of HR, OD, DEI, change management, lots of fun stuff that can absolutely have conflict come up. I am founder of Culture Elevation Consulting and really love doing a lot of advising around this. I actually created a workshop several years ago around this. So really excited to speak with you all today. And I am joining from Chicago.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And on to Melissa.
Hi, everybody. I'm Melissa Schwartzman. Really excited to be here today also. I also share the Columbia University shared from the Teachers College. I'm a HR executive, so I definitely echo the sentiment about conflict resolution is so integral in the workplace, and sitting on the C-suite and also working with all levels of employees. I think the level of readiness for people to know how to deal with conflict is very, very low. And people could just kind of figure out how to do it that before the conflict gets very big, there would be a lot less issues to deal with for the HR team, and just people would get along a lot better. So I'm glad that we're going to address this topic today. In addition to being in human resources, I also have a private practice for therapy. And so a lot of my clients are coming to me with how to deal with conflict, not only in the workplace, but also in their personal relationships. So it is big and broad because it happens with everyone, everywhere. So excited to dive in today.
That's great. And we're already hearing the theme of the earlier, the better, right? Great. And Jessica, over to you.
All right. So hi, everyone. Jessica Siegel. I am coming to you from Atlanta, Georgia. Hopefully everyone can hear me just fine because it is downpouring outside currently. And I can't turn off that noise. So I am currently serving as working at Lockton Insurance Brokerage as the Assistant Vice President for Talent Management for our Southeast region. Started there about 2 months ago, but have spent my entire career in talent development and talent management. Conflict resolution is something that it took me a while to really understand, harness, and be comfortable with that. Like many that work in HR, I should say, and outside of HR, I am a big people pleaser and hated conflict and avoided it at all costs until things would get really, really big and blow up in my face. And then one day I just kind of had the aha of, as Brene Brown would say, clear is kind, unclear is unkind, and it's not serving me and it's not serving my direct reports and my colleagues to not address things head on. So I quickly made the jump to the other side. But I think coming from that perspective of I'm not somebody who naturally loved this, but really kind of came to it by default when I was having challenges, and happy to talk about through this panel of how I made that shift and how I still kind of own that today.
Oh, we're definitely going to want to hear that, Jessica, because so many people deal with that, right? We think that we can't be nice and deal with conflict at the same time. And certainly clear is kind. Thanks for bringing in Brene Brown for a moment, because that's how we actually are nice to people. We're not nice if we're withholding, but it just doesn't feel that way. So thank you so much for that. My name is Melissa Janis. Again, my background is in learning and development, and I spent quite a few years mediating employment disputes at the EEOC. So I have seen the ugly side of this and can tell you what happens when, in fact, we don't deal with this early enough. And as Jessica suggested, and it gets really big and too big to handle, it ends up in front of a mediator or perhaps in front of a judge. I have done, actually, I'm currently now working as a leadership consultant, specifically with the management population, because I have this real passion around helping homegrown managers hit home runs. So that's what I'm working on these days. And it brings me here to talk about conflict. So let's talk about, or let's start where it starts, right? Where does conflict start happening in the workplace? Where does it trickle up and start to take hold in the workplace? Anybody want to start with that?
I'll jump in. So I think, just to kind of start things off, I think part of it is people think conflict is a bad thing. Conflict is an excellent thing if you know how to know how to manage it right, right? So, it's less about kind of thinking, oh, where does it brew, as if it's like always a terrible thing. I think anytime you bring diversity into the workplace, which hopefully everyone is bringing diversity into the workplace, you're going to have differing thoughts, opinions, and some sort of conflict. I think where it can especially get to a place of, not so productive is when not everyone's clear on the mutual goal, like where are we going towards, and if there's not a shared language between everyone. So I'll just kind of kick things off with those two kind of overarching points, and I'm sure my lovely colleagues will have a lot more to say on them.
I'm happy to dive in next. So one of my favorite frameworks around conflict and how to deal with conflict is called nonviolent communication. And the center point of how they think about conflict is that all conflict centers from unmet needs. And what I mean by that is that we all have things that we need in the workplace. So for instance, a conflict that happens between someone who is a manager and an employee, a common conflict that occurs is the employee thinks that the manager is micromanaging them. So what is the underlying needs that are happening there? Often what's happening is the manager has a need for control. They need to understand what is going on. They want to make sure that the project is delivered on time. And so they have a high level and high need for control. The employee, however, has a high level and high need for autonomy. They want to feel like they are able to make their own choices. They're able to be creative when they want to be creative. And so that's where conflict starts to come, is the two of them have needs that at first glance look like they are competing. The need for control and the need for autonomy, and they are against each other. But when we can look at conflict more holistically, we can start to see that at first it might look like the needs are competing, but if we take different strategies, we can actually start to find ways that we can solve those. So, we could create a structure or a plan for how often the check-in is so that the manager feels like they have control and the employee feels like they have a level of autonomy. So that's one of the places that I really think that conflict starts, is from unmet needs.
That's a really great example, Jess, because as you're talking through that particular scenario, we can understand how the return to the office has been so problematic for so many companies, right? Because we've got, on one hand, managers who are looking for control. They haven't learned how to manage without being able to watch somebody actually do their job, and employees are looking for autonomy. And of course, in that scenario, there's a third need, real estate. So it gets complicated, right? But the unmet needs is a really great lens to look at the sources of conflict. Melissa, did you want to jump in there?
I think Jess and Alex raised very important points. And if you tie both of what they were saying, I think it's basically about conflict arises when people don't really have a shared purpose or a shared common goal, because Jess was saying the employee and the manager are not really saying that they want to have the same vantage point that they're looking at, but they both have the shared purpose and goal. They want to get the job done. And Alex is saying when people come and have diversity, that they're not really realizing that they also really have a shared purpose and a shared goal. They're coming with different ideas and different perspectives, but they all are working for the same organization or the same department. So I think conflict can be resolved when people kind of say, wait, we really are having the shared objective, and that people need to go back to that common point where they share a common interest and kind of drill back to that before the conflict gets too big.
Right. So conflict is really just a matter of a difference, right? There's some difference that exists, and that's why we want to embrace diversity, because it brings a difference that we can harness for the better of the organization. If, as Melissa suggests, and Alex and Jess, if we recognize that these are unmet needs and there's an overarching goal that we can work toward. Jessica, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with what everyone said, and the kind of reframe that I had when I had my own personal of like conflict avoider to conflict, just I still don't enjoy it or thrive on it, but I understand the pros outweigh the cons, and I can deal with it now. But it's really an opportunity to create alignment. And something that I really realized early on when I jumped from the kind of avoider side to the let's deal with it side is people understand the intent behind the conflict, right? Like if you're being a jerk and causing conflict just for the sake of being a jerk, people understand that. If you're bringing up a questionable or, you know, a hard topic, but you're trying to get it to a point that you're landing in a better place, that the day-to-day is going to be better, the process is getting improved, that person's portfolio, you know, is going to be a little more streamlined or whatever it is, people can understand the intent behind why you're going into the conflict and trying to have the hard conversation. And most of the time, it's because we want things to land in a better place and because we care and because we're genuine about it, not because we're being jerks for the sake of being jerks. So I think that was a reframe for me of, you know, people really understand the intention of the why and why are we even going into this? And people can really sniff out the, are you a jerk, or, you know, are you really just, you care and you're trying to get things to a better place?
So it sounds like in the way you conceptualize it, that trust is really important.
Yeah.
Right? Because you've got to trust that everybody's coming with good intentions.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in my careers, I would say 98% of people do. And then we've all worked with those, you know, maybe 2%, maybe more in your career, who maybe are just jerks for the sake of being jerks.
Well, that's probably a topic for a whole nother session.
Yes.
So you talked about your own personal experience with it. What was the impact to you when you were involved in a conflict? How did you feel about it when you were avoiding rather than confronting the issue?
Oh, when I was avoiding, I was a nervous wreck. I wouldn't sleep. I would just get so much anxiety over it because I knew in the back of my head it was whatever it was had to be dealt with. The scenario in which I flipped the switch, so I think I was maybe 28, 29 and had my first direct report and had been advocating for that for a while. And the person that they gave me had been through 5 previous managers with the organization, was really scary and damaged, and had really been dragged through the mud, like just some unfortunate scenarios. And she was coming to work every day. You can tell she'd been crying in her car and she was just miserable. So our first formal, you know, one-on-one, I just said, I see you have an agenda, but I don't want to talk about that today. I don't want to get tactical. Let's take a step back and talk high level. As someone who cares for you, as somebody who's seen what you've gone through in the past few years, you've really been dragged through the mud. And I can't apologize enough for that, but that has, you know, that wasn't because of me. But now that we're working together, I want you to be happy every day coming to work, or at least feel comfortable every day coming to work. So what you're experiencing right now, crying every day coming to work, miserable while you're here, it can't continue. So right now, I want you to take a step back and use this opportunity of us working together as a reset. And either you're going to come back in a few days and say, I want to make things better, or you're going to come back in a few days and say, there's so much water, I can't get over the bridge. And whatever you decide to do, I'm going to be your number one cheerleader, but it's your decision. And she walked out of my office and I was like bawling and shut the door and was like shaking. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe that was the first like conflict management conversation I had to have. But I just felt so relieved because it's the conversation that needed to happen. And she thanked me later and did end up exiting the organization, which probably was the right decision for her at that point. But at least she felt like she could do it in a way that she was seen and validated and respected.
That's such a great story. I love that. Yeah. So we see the impact, right, of avoidance on the individual. And then when you're dealing with it proactively, even though she left the organization, that's not the measure of success here. The measure of success is how you both felt about it and how you were able to work through to something that worked for everybody.
Right, because I don't think retaining an employee who was unhappy and unproductive was going to be the success story that
exactly. Exiting her actually was the success.
Right.
Yeah. So what's the impact on the rest of the team when there's conflict? What's the damage to the team and productivity?
I can chime in here because I've worked in a lot of teams where there were one or more people in conflict that were on the team, and the productivity takes a very big dip because so much time and energy is spent talking about the conflict between the two team members. So not only are they those team members engaging in conflict and they're not productive because they are taking the time to thinking about those interactions, how they're going to one up the other person, how they're going to take action. And then the other team members were all talking about and gossiping about what's happening. And then there's alliances that are formed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who's agreeing with one person versus the other person. So it's reverberations, not only for people not having a high performing team from the aspect of that people aren't getting along interpersonally, people are not doing their job effectively, and it really takes a toll on everybody. And
it's even past the team, right? Because they start talking to people on other teams about what's going on. It's like a virus through the organization. I want to give a shout out to Laura Haney, who commented about this in the chat, that she's agreeing that percentage-wise, there are far more good intentions, as Jessica suggested. But what's troubling is the amount of time that's spent addressing the troublemaker, right? And people taking sides and all of that. Yeah. And and Kimberly says, and recruiting going on to help people take sides. So it becomes a thing, and the energy in the organization goes to that instead of productivity. Did anybody else want to add something to that? What you're seeing?
I would love to add just a little bit of, when that happens, when there is a taking of the side, it's really important for you as a leader to think about, how can I make sure that I am not taking sides, that I am helping to facilitate empathy so that people can see the other side, not the side that they're taking with, but they can see what's going on for the other person. And that's really how we start to begin to solve it, is being able to facilitate empathy. And it can be really hard, especially when we're in a virtual environment, when people aren't seeing each other, they aren't connecting as much anymore. It can be really hard, and the conflict can just kind of fester. And so our job is to really try and figure out, how do we start to facilitate empathy rather than that taking of sides.
Yeah. What suggestions do you have to help leaders do that, Jess?
Yeah. So the first is, we were talking about unmet needs, trying to understand and get to the root of what are the unmet needs for the person who is, on each side of the conflict, having conversations with each person, being able to understand with open-ended questions. Really, the key is open-ended questions, trying to just explore, hear what they have to say, and try and just dig a little bit deeper until you understand what's actually the root of the problem. They might say, oh, this person is so mean to me, or this person is always derogatory. What do they mean by that? And can we analyze and figure out, how do we, create some of the things that they're saying, rather than in a form of something that is going to be, hurtful or angry towards someone else? How do we get down to what's actually the root of the problem? And how do we explain it in a way that's non-judgmental? So rather than saying that they're, mean to me, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that they're not delivering their projects on time to you? Does that mean that they're slacking you, phrases that are not kind? What does that mean? And so if we can actually get to the key thing that's going on, that's going to make it a lot easier for us to start to work with that problem.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for teasing it apart and really understanding what's going on. Alex, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, so I'm also currently pursuing my PhD, and my dissertation focus is on trust. And, one of the things that when it comes to developing trust, especially in diverse environments, is, I found just the word empathy. There's a lot of leaders who struggle with that. And I think it's kind of the word itself kind of connotes that maybe more warm and fuzzy, and feel like, oh, I don't really have that. What I found to be especially effective is perspective taking, which is really effectively what Jess was talking about, but really getting them to say, look, I am not expecting you to, really kind of literally put yourself in the shoes of someone who is drastically different than you, but I just want you to take a perspective. And often that's translating it to something that's impacted them in a similar way, or impacted their family in a similar way. And if you can kind of, again, it's about that language that you use. So not just the shared language, but just, the types of phrases you use that can really resonate. And I think too, we've talked a lot about interpersonal conversations and conflict, just thinking about from a systemic perspective and habits perspective, even doing things like starting the meeting with ground rules, right? And starting that to be kind of a a thing that you do every single meeting. When we talk about like team productivity and the impact, if everyone kind of just starts following these same behaviors and implements them in all of their meetings, you start to get behaviors like actually digging into the root cause, digging into the problem versus, just, again, assuming there's issues, all of that. And I think the other thing is, and I, I realize I'm kind of going against the name of the panel, but I don't believe in conflict resolution. I believe in conflict management. I feel like resolution connotes that it's automatically a compromise or something that really kind of dilutes both sides. When really, if you talk about collaboration, it's not about diluting either side. It's actually just coming together for something bigger and better. So those are just kind of some thoughts that were coming to mind from more the systemic perspective as we were talking through some of these different scenarios.
Lots of gems in there. Thanks, Alex. Let's tease out that bit about the organizational factors, right? There are systemic factors in the workplace because we talked about conflict and we talked about it mostly stemming from interpersonal differences, preferences, and so forth. And yet there are organizational causes of conflict that put people at odds with one another. And they think that it's between the two of them, but it's really not, right? Role conflicts, for example, when there's lack of role clarity and people can be in conflict over that. When there are goal conflicts, sales and marketing, need I say more, right? And so to Melissa's point earlier, looking for that common ground in the overarching goal might be a way to solve for that. Farhad raised a really great question in the chat around what happens with conflict coming from the top. So it looks like there are two people that are at odds with one another in an organization. I've personally seen it with two directors in different parts of a business who are not on the same page, right? And their people act out their conflict. So the directors look like they're okay, they're getting along, they're passive aggressively getting together and having lovely conversations. But downstream, their people are at odds because they're not aligned, right? It looks like the conflict is with the people, with the employees, but the conflict belongs to the directors. So what do we do about that? How do you, or let me just offer out, have any of you, either of you seen conflicts that belong elsewhere? And how do you empower employees to deal with that scenario?
Well, I think it's really important that that's kind of handled, from, because things have to be handled from the top to the bottom and then the bottom to the top, right, to have an effective organization. So if it's observed, right, that these directors at the more senior level are having these habits and then they're really talking amongst their own teams, right, negatively about another team, and then that's being perpetuated and cascaded down. I think it's important that, and usually these things get back to HR in some way. So I think it's important that the HR person in the organization talks to these individual directors and bring this to their attention, that there's having these negative reverberations, and that it's important that they're modeling better behavior. And whatever organizational issue, right, that's causing this conflict, right, that they figure out how that's going to happen, and that they are really more mindful about how they're modeling this behavior for their teams. And so there's some coaching that's involved, and then they really have awareness about how their own behavior is really influencing and driving other people's behaviors. There might just not be any awareness about how impactful it is. And so really having that understanding, I think some educational and awareness, and helping them really understand and then model back the behaviors, like kind of stop doing it, but also really maybe be more transparent with their team and just say, it's really important that working cross-functionally, that we're having good relationships with other departments. And maybe in the past, I have said some things, but in order to work effectively, we're really going to need to change these types of behaviors. So, but that's a big ideal situation, I realize that I'm saying. So in reality, we only might get a quarter of the way initially.
Well, I think you're pointing out that HR plays a really important role in looking to see where conflict is actually happening when it's under the surface, and having the courageous conversations and the difficult conversations, but showing that professional courage to talk to people about it, senior leaders about those behaviors and what can be. I think the other lever is that very often this is about role clarity and goals. And so that sits with HR to help anyway, and gives us a lever to open that conversation. Absolutely. Does anybody else want to add anything about systemic conflict? Jess?
Yeah, I was just going to add, Melissa, you were making, both Melissas, you were making such incredible points. But really, one of the things that I want to, double click on is, when we're bringing these issues so say we've had these two directors that we know are having problems. One of the things that I think really is important is when you're bringing up to them what's happening, target the problem and not the person. So really try and make sure that we're not targeting that, who they are, or trying to give any sort of personality or character traits on them, but instead we're targeting the repercussions. What's the impact of what's happening? What's the impact of their behaviors? Let's talk specifically about the behaviors. So when you share with your team about this that's bad about the other team, that causes this break, and we talked at the very beginning about shared goals. So if we can link it to how the problems are impacting and not helping us get to our shared goals, that's going to make it far more powerful to help us actually shift some of these behaviors. But it's really about bringing that awareness to the behaviors and allowing people to know that it's not them as a person, it's really some of these behaviors that we need to shift.
Yeah, and focusing on the problem, right? Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, one thing that came to mind is, so yes, absolutely focusing on the problem, not the person, not making kind of, character judgments, because we all have different definitions, especially if you think, across cultures about what's rude and, just kind of different norms. So that's something to keep in mind. And I think from a systemic perspective, thinking about how our biases show up as the person who's supposed to be the one managing the conflict. So at a previous organization, I was actually in a conversation where I witnessed definite microaggressions against a Black woman in the organization. It was incredibly frustrating because I felt like she and I had the exact same communication style, very direct, to the point, but yet she was catching a lot of heat from a C-suite leader that I felt was not deserved, and that I pointed out in the conversation, and ended up actually having to go to the CEO for them to have a conversation with that person. Obviously, that's not an ideal scenario. If I could have gone back, I wish that we had had a little bit more conversations with leadership, previously, about how biases might show up. We had manager training, but I don't think we had done enough for the senior leaders. So often we kind of assume that they they should have had all these trainings getting up to where they are, and that doesn't necessarily happen. And I think that also speaks to previous points around just kind of assuming that conflict's going to be bad, assuming you're going to have conflict with this particular person, and not knowing how biases might influence that. So, obviously a lot of us know about kind of gender and racial biases, but even, that person might remind you of a family member that gets on your nerves. And that is why you are having that much more conflict with them. So if you have the tools in place to mitigate bias, to just kind of bring attention to those things, I think that that's a really important piece to also just managing the conflict.
So that's a really good transition for us to pivot to what do we do about it? What are the kinds of tools that we have available to us in HR in particular to help us with our conflicts and to help our clients in the organization manage theirs? Jessica?
So I think when it comes to managing conflict, a lot of times there's people who are just looking for validation, or they just want to be heard, even though their thoughts or sentiments may not be implemented or may not be viable. people are really just looking for that validation and to feel like they matter, they're significant, and that their thoughts and opinions are relevant. So whether it's interpersonal, we've been focusing on that a lot, or even I'm thinking of an example years ago, I had a direct report who he wasn't wrong. He was like, we need a new CRM. The one we have is complete garbage and it's causing all of these problems. And he was not wrong. The cost for a new CRM was going to be between $700,000 and $1.2 million. We didn't have the money for that, and he knew that. But what we ended up doing was I said, okay, you're not wrong. I know what the cost is for these four because I've had, presentations and implemented them at previous companies. Let's pick one that what would be your ideal system? Let's do a demo and let's get a price. And it came back, I think the price was 1.3 million. And he's like, oh, there's no way we can afford that. And I was like, you're right. There's no way, absolutely no way this organization can afford this expense. And I said, you're not wrong, but how can we work within the framework of the technology that we have available, not spending an additional $1.3 million that wasn't in the budget that's never going to get approved. So how can we work with what we have now, or maybe, one or two cheaper systems? So we ended up implementing a project management tool that was $45 a license for the year at the time, which was much more doable than 1.3 million. So I think there's a lot of times that people are looking for that validation, but also, the respect of you're not wrong, but also $1.3 million is not a realistic budget request right now.
That story so resonates with me. One of the cases I mediated at the EEOC was actually a woman who worked in a bridal shop who apparently was overstepping her bounds and was very vocal about what the brides looked like and overstepped the owners. And the owners decided, I kid you not, to retire her. And she just thought she was being a really good salesperson. She cared about the company, thought management was making mistakes. And she changed what they were doing and how she was interacting with clients. But she was selling dresses. Says they had their top salesperson, but they didn't want her there because they felt that they weren't being heard. She felt she wasn't being heard. And we mediated that case. What I would say is really important is that people in mediation don't feel heard if the manager doesn't come. Right. So even when they go to mediation, companies don't send the manager and miss the opportunity for the employee to be heard and end up going to court. I cannot tell you how many times I mediated cases and the manager was not there. And I'm like, you just missed, I don't know if we're going to solve this today.
Yeah, people just want validation. They just want to be heard.
She just wanted to know she was a valued employee and it just was not a match anymore. That's it. And it cost them a lot. It would have cost them a lot of money had we not settled. But the point is that it costs companies a lot of money to win disputes. It could cost you $500,000 to win a dispute. That's not a win. So we do want to hear people early and show them respect. I mean, that's where the respect comes from, right? Is being heard. What other solutions do we have at hand so that people don't have to go to mediation or court as a last resort? What is really within our ability as HR folks to do to manage conflict and to help our clients?
Well, one of the things we can do is long before conflict even starts is to train everyone in how to give effective feedback. This is one of the things I go into, and I go into a lot of companies and I train up their managers on how do we give effective feedback. Because if things bubble up and they get too big, then you end up in those situations. But if you can teach people the key skills that they need early on so that they're able to, if someone frustrates them, if their employee doesn't deliver a project on time, if any of these things happen, rather than, resisting and holding back and letting things bubble, a lot of managers have a fear of giving feedback. A lot of even employees have a fear of giving feedback to their manager. It's very, very difficult to sometimes give feedback upwards. So if we can learn the key skills of how to give feedback, everyone has that same language in the organization, it really kind of mitigates things before it gets to the place where it's too late.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Another thing that I have found to be effective is to be very clear about what people are going to be evaluated on and how they're going to be evaluated. I have been in a lot of organizations where people have changed the performance management form and or the rating scale within the same performance management year. And that has caused a lot of issues. I've also seen that people's goals have shifted within the performance management year and they've not been updated or shared, or people who are in professional services, clients have changed and then metrics have changed accordingly. So I think it's really important that people always know how people are going to be evaluated. Or again, if people's jobs have changed, responsibilities have changed, that's very clear. And we also know org changes are very big now, right? Restructuring. So if people get a new manager, that people are sat down, really understood what the new expectations are, things like that. So I think it's really important that people have role clarity and people really understand what the expectations are. So a lot of miscommunications that way.
And in what you're both saying, there are themes of trust and transparency and fairness. I mean, it's inherently unfair to move the goalposts during the season, right? And so we're setting ourselves up in HR for failure when we take that on, because the impact to the employees is so, it's really adverse for them. It impacts their their compensation for the year. That's a pretty big motivator to be upset about. Absolutely.
I can chime in on this one, Melissa. I think in corporate America, we do a really good job with the shared reward model, and that shows up in, whether you're a shareholder or an annual bonus, that shows up in a really big way in corporate America. Some years bigger than others, depending on company performance, but right, we have a model in place for that. What we're not great about in corporate America is shared risk, right? So for instance, with the business I was working in during COVID, I remember the beginning of Q2, which was, right after lockdown started, our sales team was freaking out. And we had our performance reviews in June. Q2 was terrible, no contracts closed, no sales. That was pretty typical for a lot of businesses at that point in time. And the leaders of that organization didn't really do a great job of managing expectations of like, hey, we know there's a global pandemic and lockdown, and your job isn't really business as usual. And that's not a reflection on you. It's a reflection of the world around you. And this is how we're going to change expectations. And this is how we're going to close out this, fiscal year that ends in June. So the sales team was walking around for months and months thinking, oh, we're all going to get, fired. We're going to have terrible ramifications. We're going to get no payout for bonus, all of these things, because the leadership was in real time trying to figure out what to do and wanted to have like a fully formed answer rather than just checking in with the team and being vulnerable of like, wow, things are not going how any of us anticipated based on what's going on in the world. And we know it's impacting you. And here's the initial conversations that we're having. And, we want to come back to you when we have the plans a little more formulated, but we just want to let you know, like, we see you, we see the effort you're putting in. So I just think as corporate America, we don't necessarily do a great job of like addressing the shared risk and the realities of whether it's leadership changes in our organizations or large global things like a pandemic that changed the world we're operating in overnight. We don't really do a great job of making adjustments and communicating that out as things are happening.
Mm-hmm. So how do we encourage open communication in the organization? How do we make that happen?
I think it's a shared vulnerability, right? Like you don't have to have all the answers and just be like, hey, we're struggling with this too. And we don't have the answers, but we want feedback on X, Y, and Z. Let us go convene. We'll come back to you. I think leaders feel so much pressure to be like, we need to have the answer in a fully formulated plan that they let things get too far along before they actually have those check-in conversations.
Yeah. And in a world of fast-paced change like we live in today, it would be really, really good if we could let go of I need to have all the right answers today. Absolutely. Alex, you were going to chime in?
So +1 to everything Jessica said. And then in addition to that, I think how does accountability show up in your workplace. I think that's a really huge thing, because if something happens, right, something fails, so to speak, and the go-to is, well, who did this, and it's this kind of like everyone's scared to speak up about like who did it, versus when we talk about innovative cultures, right, we celebrate failures, we talk about lessons learned, and there's also shared accountability. It doesn't mean you don't have accountability. In fact, that's going to do the opposite for conflict management. But it's, how do you show up around accountability? What does that look like? Do people feel safe to speak up and say something, right? So I think that is a huge piece of it that can encourage that open communication.
I see Melissa and Jess also nodding. Did either of you want to add anything there?
Well, one thing I wanted to add was I saw Bethany was asking about how do you actually give feedback? How do you talk about that? And so there's a couple just key pointers that I'd love to just explain a little bit. So I have a roadmap that I've called the 7 steps to giving effective feedback. And really the very first thing that a lot of people miss is asking for permission. And it seems kind of silly at first, but if you want to give someone feedback, it's really important to create a culture where you ask people if you can give them feedback. That doesn't mean that if the person says no, you're never going to give them feedback, but it just means that you're creating an opportunity so that they can feel ready to receive that feedback. Because, if someone just gave a presentation and you're asking to give them feedback on that presentation in that moment, maybe they're a little bit overwhelmed. Maybe they already know it didn't go great and they need to process and just like settle their nervous system before they can receive your feedback. So asking for permission is really the first key. One of the other really important keys is trying to take your feedback and turning it into raw data. And I talked a little bit about this earlier, but what I mean by this is when you want to be describing the person's behaviors, the things that they did, not criticizing the actual person. And you want to get as specific as possible. I like to describe it as like, imagine you were a hidden camera and you were observing the behavior. What would that camera have captured? So instead of saying, you want to give someone feedback on always arriving late, instead of saying, why can't you just arrive on time to work? You would say, I noticed that you arrived late 4 times this week. And then talk about the impact of how that impacts you, your team, your clients, everyone else, so they understand why it's important. And those are really some of the most important factors for giving effective feedback, is asking for permission, making sure you're being really clear that it's not about the person, that you're connecting with them as a person, but you're giving them this feedback on their behavior or the action. And then you're describing the impact of what it's had on you or your team or anyone else.
Yeah, and to add to that, as we're all thinking about this in terms of HR really being supportive and helping managers really being able to deliver this effective feedback and really being specific about behaviors, I think what's helpful for some tools to give them is when they give the feedback, and whether it's through the performance management process or that, to really be able to quantify and qualitatively give the feedback. So if you're telling somebody that they are what they did on the presentation, but also when performance management time comes away, what is a meets expectation person, right? If you have some competencies or things that differentiate a meets expectations from an exceeds, or what is somebody who's going to get a promotion to the next job title, you can give managers these tools in their toolkit to actively explain what those things look like. It really helps to have those discussions that managers have trouble doing. So I meant to add before, and it was a nice segue what you were saying, to give these feedback and to have these difficult conversations, the more concrete things that we can give managers tools to have these conversations, it'll help these feedback and also help people be on the same page when they're having these discussions.
Yeah, managing expectations is really, really key. Thank you for that. I think one of our participants put in the chat a free LinkedIn guide. A free guide on
that was me. I put that in.
I was just showing up as LinkedIn. I
just threw that in just so that, people want to dive deeper. It's a free guide. So in case you have to give feedback yourself, you can just read through that and kind of go through step by step for yourself.
Gift with purchase today. That's wonderful. So someone else in the group had posted about an ombuds. And I'm wondering if anyone on the panel has had experience with organizations using ombuds, and if we might touch upon that for a moment. So this is very telling. So an ombuds is a neutral who can be employed within an organization to help with conflict. And if we were in the government, we might be more familiar with them because some government agencies use them. But this is very telling and disappointing that we don't have experience with it, because it means that organizations aren't using them to the extent that they could be. But if you have conflict within your organization and it's something that you feel needs additional support, there is a role called an ombuds that you could bring in that would report directly to the president, so they're not encumbered by any relationships internally. I don't want to do an ad for ombuds, but I do think that they can play a very key and helpful pivotal role within an organization, because it provides a safe place for people to go to beyond an EAP or a hotline, someone who is skilled, usually a mediator, who can help you with conflicts, so that the employees are basically empowered to go back into the workplace and help solve their own stuff, right? It's also a place where, or a person who identifies those systemic conflicts within the workplace, so that if it was two directors going at it, for example, this person might be the one who picks up on that. And they also do the investigation. So it's another role if you're thinking about an actual alternative dispute resolution system within your organization and you want to take it to that next level. But let's go back to the conversations around open communication and other kinds of tactics that are within our bag of tricks in HR. Is there anything else that we can offer to our participants today as suggestions for help, that things they can take on to help them with conflict? We've already talked about training, and particularly around feedback and conflict resolution, in order to have that same language around conflict that can be so helpful, and the kinds of interventions that we can do in terms of coaching. Is there anything else that you can recommend that our participants might be able to do?
I'm happy to recommend something. So the Harvard Negotiation Project calls one of the most important things in conflict negotiation is interest-based negotiation. And what they mean by this is it's really important that when we are, trying to solve a problem, we figure out, and we talked about this before, the underlying needs of what each person needs. What are their desires? What would be the best outcome that they could have? And what the next thing that they often recommend is that they say the best conflict negotiators are actually very creative. They're artists. And what I mean by this is that they get very creative in different strategies to solve a problem. And so one thing that's often recommended is to take all the people who are involved in the conflict and to do a 10-minute brainstorm. Have everyone put their craziest ideas about how they think that this conflict could be solved. What could we do that would actually meet everyone's interest or everyone's needs? Are there creative ways of solving this that we haven't thought of before? So doing just a 10-minute brainstorm and allowing all ideas to be open and flowing might get you to come up with new ideas that you might not have thought of before to be able to solve some of the underlying problems.
Great. So to get there, go ahead, Alex.
Oh, no, I was just going to add on, I think really making sure that crowdsourcing of feedback is implemented as, just a cultural norm, as well as obviously definitely at performance management. So for instance, I know, like I tend to be very direct and have very strong viewpoints, but my viewpoint is not the only viewpoint. So for instance, with my direct report, if I thought something, I would, provided it's not egregious, right? But if I thought something, if I had some, criticisms, whatever, about something, I would hold on to it unless I heard from someone else. If I heard from more than one person that this is actual kind of feedback that they need to hear, absolutely. If they came to me and asked like, oh, what would you have done differently? Sure, I'll give that to them. But it can really go a long way with, again, that building trust, because so many times we feel like our manager only comes to us with criticisms. And there's someone in the chat had talked about positive feedback. I think the other thing is we are actually more terrible at positive feedback than we are at, constructive or negative feedback, right? I'm sure all of us have been guilty of, oh, great job. Well, but you didn't give them specifics on why it was a great job, right? Maybe it was, their delivery, but the slides maybe need a little bit of work. But maybe they thought you said great job because their slides were phenomenal. And then they have their own ideas of what we should work on. So I think just kind of some of those establishing those cultural norms can be super helpful.
Yeah, we need to be specific in our feedback for sure.
One thing that I have found helpful when working with folks around conflict negotiation is the very old idea of locus of control, right? It's something that we all know, but something that we often forget about, right? You can't control the other person. You can't control the organization budget. And even though you might have the best idea ever, it's just not realistic and it's just not going to happen. So helping people understand what's within their locus of control and like, you can't change that other person or you can't increase the budget, but what can you do that's going to make this a little bit more manageable in your day-to-day, right? What can you affect control over? I think can be a really powerful reminder for people, because I think that's where a lot of like resentment comes in of like, right, like you're not wrong, but you can't change that other person, or the resolution, even though it's, a great idea, just isn't viable for whatever reason. So I think the locus of control. And the other thing that I have found when people feel stuck in conflict, you always have a choice, right? You may not like your choices, but you always have a choice, and you may have more choices than you realize. So helping people think through of what are your options in this scenario, and maybe you don't want to exercise one of them or all of them, and that's okay. But even just feeling like you have multiple paths that you can go down from this place where you're stuck can be really freeing and empowering for people, because it's hard when people feel trapped in a bad situation and feel like there's no way to exit the room.
And that provides a great transition. We just have 5 minutes left. I don't want to make the choice to end the session, but I'm going to have to because we only have a few minutes left. So let me ask you this for each of you. What are just a few words of wisdom that you'd like to provide the audience today as we wrap up? Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Sure. I'll just, I'll say when it comes to the group, you're finding conflict, people have different ideas, like unite around the common goal and, revert to that discussion. Is what we're talking about coming back to our common goal? And then if there's then you can also find out if there's disagreement on the common goal, right? So really just, focusing in on that, I think can go a long way.
Great. Any other words of wisdom to share, Melissa?
I would just say that we've talked about a lot of great things to implement and approaches to take on, but always know that there's going to be some people are going to be harder to win over than others, but don't be discouraged by that, and to just kind of know that you have a great way to be influencing and keep pushing on with those people. Because when you have an organization and there's a few people that aren't on board, they can really make a negative and destructive.
I think we lost the end of that. Okay. Jessica?
I would say as the resident previous conflict avoider in the group, don't be afraid, right? The longer you let things fester, the bigger things grow and the more messy they become. So while I'm still not the person who's going to, at the first inkling, just like go in there, like I don't thrive on conflict. I'm still not that person. I don't think I ever will be. But just really understanding when things are going on, like Alex said, like, oh, this is just something I observed, or I got big feedback from multiple people, or this has happened multiple times. But the earlier that you can recognize what's going on and address it, the better it will be, because the longer things go on, the bigger and messier and hairier that they get.
Absolutely. Look for the patterns. And Jess?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to double down on something that Melissa said. Really, I think it's so important for you to know that as you're trying to solve conflict, it's not all on you. It does take two people to be willing to do it. And, it's not your fault. You're not a bad person if you're not able to solve some of the conflict. Some of the best conflict negotiators in the world have been working for over 50 years on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and that one still hasn't been solved. So know that sometimes it is not about you, and there's a lot of deeper issues, and so you can do the best you can, and that's your job to try and do the best you can on these conflicts, but also give yourself a little bit of compassion when sometimes things are so entangled that it's hard to untangle them. And I also just want to say thank you so much to Melissa Janis. I know that she jumped in last minute to be the moderator today, and you have been phenomenal. No one would did an amazing job. She did not come prepared with questions. Normally moderators, have weeks to prepare their questions. Just incredible job for you. And hopefully the audience knows what an incredible job she did today.
That was very kind of you, Jess. Thank you so very much. You guys made it easy. Thank you so much for being a wonderful, wonderful panel and collaborating with me and showing that really great things can come out of conflict. It could have been like a nightmare. And instead, we pulled together. So thank you for that. I'm going to leave the audience with just one additional thought. When you see that conflict and you're frustrated with someone else, dig deeper. Try to understand what it is that they want. Why is it so important to them? And then look in the mirror and try to understand why your position is so important to you. When Jess talked about coming up with those great ideas, they come from pulling away the skin around the onion and finding out what's at the heart of it. I know the Columbia people are going like this, right? We heard about the onion and the onion, but that's what conflict is. When you can pull it away and really understand the why behind what people are wanting and demanding, that's where you can find your integrative solutions and your common ground and reframe it as something that you can do together. So I hope you found this a helpful session and you're empowered to work with your clients to resolve conflicts in a really constructive way. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Melissa.